Today, we are going to be talking about drawing the human in a full foreshortened pose and how we can use perspective as a tool to help us out. So, just as a quick disclaimer, this can get complicated, but don't let that stop you. Please give this a try, give it a practice. This isn't the one and only solution of how to do this. A lot of this is kind of just feeling it out, but this is just a way to learn how to accurately, or at least more accurately, draw someone in a kind of really interesting below or above view in your pictures with your imagination. So in order to do that, we're going to be looking at reference, and we're going to look at photos and how other artists have handled this and how we can use perspective to break this down. But it all starts here with our basic knowledge of drawing humans. So here we have our average human, right? I use this based on the principle of the 8 heads male study. So here's my guides, right? So if you count them, we got 8 sections here because the average ideal, and I'm doing air quotes as I'm saying this, male figure is 8 heads high. So here he is, here's the 8 heads. What this information does give us though is we learn where the halfway points are. So here's our human with the halfway line, and we can see that right above the groin is our halfway mark of our human. So we can also just kind of say somewhere around the waist is going to be the halfway part of the human that we're drawing. And this is going to apply to females, males, same basis, just kind of we're using this guy just as a base guideline because the average ideal for women is like 7.5 heads or something like that. I didn't want to deal with the half head, but either way, it doesn't really matter how many heads high someone is. The halfway mark is always going to land somewhere within the waist to the pubic region. So knowing that, we can also cut this guy into quarters. So here's a view of what he would look like quartered down, right? So we can see that we have the top of the head to the lower chest. We have the lower chest to the waist, or right above the pubic bone. We have the waist to the knee, about the middle of the knee or the bottom of the knee, and then from there to the bottom of the feet. So why does this matter if we're going to be drawing people in foreshortened perspective? Well, simply put, if we just took these dimensions and threw them onto a rectangle, this is what it would look like. But now we want to remember, if we throw this rectangle into perspective, these lines are no longer going to match up perfectly at this halfway point. But we do have a tool that lets us figure out where the halfway points are in perspective. All right, so if you guys don't know this tool and you want to learn a little more about it, you can always look up my perspective videos where I do go more into detail about drawing cubes in perspective. But here we have just a basic vanishing point that I threw in, right? So I'll label that as VP. What I'm going to do is draw in a rectangle shape here right on top. Oh, let's make that darker. There we go. And just like that. So now you can see we have a rectangle shape right on top of our perspective line. So this is our vanishing point, and our cube is going into our vanishing point. So if I were to go find the halfway point, it would be right here, right? Not necessarily, because this rectangle is in perspective. If you want to remember the last video that we did too, when things change view, when they change perspective, they change angles, so did the points. So does the halfway points and the other points within the item. So the way we find this is we create an X going corner to corner. So from here to here, and from here to here. Now, what this lets me know is that if I were to cross a straight line through right here, that is my halfway point. So let's turn off these guys for a second. And you can see, visually, you're probably like, Josh, that does not look like the halfway point at all of this object. But in truth of perspective, this is the halfway line. That means that if we were to use this to draw him, that line represents this line right here. meaning that the person who we're going to draw in this box, let's say, their waist would line up somewhere around that area. So if I were to draw someone in here, and we're just going to draw him really quick using the perspective lines, his waist would line up somewhere around here, and his legs would be this whole part from here to here, and we get really nice big feet. Something like that. Okay. You can even take this and do the reverse idea. So I can draw my head somewhere up here. I know it's going to be bigger because we're really looking at it nice and tall. And then, you know someone's chest is here, and then their waist has to fall here. Okay. And then so from here to here, it's going to be the guy's legs. And they're nice and small because perspective is telling us that they're getting further and further away from us. So in a nutshell, this is what we're going to be looking at today. All right, so let's focus on this one on the left for right now really quick. You can see that basically we have the same diagram that I just drew for you guys right there. We're looking at the halfway mark, to the top of the head, to the bottom of the feet, and then of course you can see that these lines about line up with the original points. Now you want to remember when we're drawing something in perspective, these lines are not always going to match up exactly where they are. If you guys check out the video that we did before this, you know that when the head tilts up or down, all of a sudden those proportions, those lines that we know, they change a little bit. They get skewed, right? So you can see on this figure, for example, like this would be the halfway line, which again, it's around that pubic region, right? But here's the lower chest line, and you can see that it's just below the chest line. So then why are we learning this if it doesn't line up exactly? Well, it does line up close enough that if you're drawing from your imagination, you can kind of just figure it out and feel it. You also want to remember that we are drawing a 3D object, so we're not just going to draw the front face of this square, we're also thinking about where this square or rectangle sits in perspective. So if this line doesn't necessarily match up with the bottom of the chest, well, if I look for that back line, and I come somewhere in the middle between that back line and that front line, well, it kind of does give me the chest, right? So we have to remember that the person isn't sitting like completely, just smashing their face against this front half of our rectangle shape that we're drawing them within. These are just going to be the basic guidelines, and you're going to see this too with the photography that I kind of break down. Things line up, but they don't line up exactly, and we just kind of have to remember that when we're drawing. So this artist here, you can see he really broke it down. Right here, he broke it down into thirds, or if he went a little bit more into detail, he went 1, 2, 3, but then he also took out a little chunk here just to kind of think of the contact point of where this person's butt is sitting on the bench. Now this artist kind of is self-explanatory, where you can see this diagram right here. He did it in numbers. We don't need to do numbers. Let's not make this a math problem. Perspective is already complicated enough, but he broke his squares down into thirds, and they're even thirds. 1, 2, 3. If you measure them, they'd be about even. I'm sure he's not measuring, he's just looking visually. So you can see that he now, in perspective, thinks about where those cubes would split. So even if you go to different angles, like this one right here, you can tell that he knows exactly where these squares are going to line up in perspective, and they always match up with the same points. So the shoulder is around this line. The bottom of his butt is right here around this line, or you could say the top of his, or the midpoint of his waist right there. And then his foot lines up right there at the bottom of that square. Similarly with his head, as we know, is going to line up at the top. So he's just giving himself some landmarks. Look right here to this example. So we can see here that it's kind of lining up with that shoulder. We know that we have this line here, which is going to be the point of contact with the bench. And then right here, even though it's in a different perspective because our lines are traveling off to a vanishing point somewhere over here, right? We know that this is where his foot is making contact with the ground. And so then you still have his 3 points. 1, 2, 3. So okay, this is a lot of lines. It's a lot of me drawing arrows and stuff, so this probably doesn't make sense yet. But let's try and look at a couple photos that I got from extreme views of people that I found on Pinterest And let's see if we can break them down into some sort of a 3D dimensional shape and then give it a try drawing it. All right, so here we have a picture of someone that I would say is probably applying to Target, except they don't have beige pants on, so I don't know. But we have a very Target store themed picture here. That's besides the point. I am just talking randomness. Let's try to figure out how we can get a cube around this person. So we want to remember, if you remember from the head drawing, that this is the front of the face, and then this would be the top of the box, right? If a face was a box. So what that tells us, and she is looking up at us, so this would be a little bit different if she was just looking straight forward. But we know that somewhere around the top of our cube is gonna be somewhere here. And we want to remember that this is gonna be the biggest point of our cube, because essentially we have a vanishing point that's somewhere down further than that point, but below our page. All right, so now that we have a kind of line in there, let's find the bottom point. The bottom point that I'm going to find is just going to be right in front of the toes here. We have a pretty straight standing pose, so we don't have to worry about too much perspective here. We're really only seeing the front and maybe a little bit of the top. So this line is just going to connect right there where her toes connect. And then from there, I'm just going to bring it up somewhere around here. It's okay if it cuts into her arms a little bit. But we just want to think about how extreme this perspective is, so we can make it even a little wider if we want to. Something messy like that. All right, so we have found the front face of our box. So then what we know now is that we do see the top of the box here. And we know that objects have to at least go somewhere off into the distance, so these lines would be converging inwards, not just going completely straight and perfect, right? So with that in mind, we're just going to go ahead and just draw in our lines as if they were going to some far away vanishing point, and we can finish them up somewhere above the head like that. All right, so we can use that same logic and just kind of apply it down here as well. You can kind of follow the angle that her foot is going, if that helps you. You want to imagine where's the back of her foot. We can see her pants bowing right here, so we know that the bottom of her heel has to at least be somewhere around there. So even if I'm a little off, I'm going to say the back of her foot probably lines up somewhere there. I can go a little bit higher. We'll say somewhere around there. And then of course you can just connect this point to this point like so. And then we can connect this point to this point. And there we go. So this can be a little confusing. Now we're looking at a 3D box. You want to imagine her in this 3D space. This would ideally fit her body. So now we can come through and figure out some of these dimensions. So we don't get confused, I'm going to change the perspective lines that are behind her a different color than the front facing perspective lines. Okay, so we have this broken down. I put the back lines in purple so we don't get too confused. The front facing rectangle is in green, and what we want to find is the halfway point of our reference picture. So if I'm looking for the halfway point of her, which should be somewhere around the waist, remember it might not line up perfectly, but I'm going to put a point from here to here, and I'm going to create that line, and then I'm going to create another line from here to there, which is going to give us a point somewhere around here, which you can see is really not too far off from her hips. And because of the angle, her hips are actually curving around this way anyway, so they're wrapping around because they're within a 3D shape, and actually somewhere along that point her hips are lining up with that point. And now what happens if we break that down into our quarters? All right, so as you can see, when we break this down into quarters, now we're not lining up exactly, right? Like ideally this line would be the lower chest, which is somewhere down below here. But it does line up with something that is also important, which is where the chest lines up to, which is the bottom of the shoulder. So we are still finding these important points. Now with our last line down here, we can see that it's lining up about with the ankle. And that is accurate. It just looks really inaccurate because of the angle. And we just have to keep remembering that these proportions are a little displaced because of how we're looking at this in perspective. Okay, so now it's our job to give this a go. So this does seem really complicated. I understand, but what we want to do is we just want to kind of use what we did on our cheat sheet over here, our reference, use that breakdown. We're going to create our breakdown over here, and then we're just going to kind of place the items where we see them. For this one, guys, don't worry too much about facial features and details like necklaces, clothing designs, all that stuff. We just kind of want rough shapes in here because, again, we're just thinking about figure placement, not so much figure details and stuff like that. That could be another video. Alright, so first to draw this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to copy that rectangle shape that we have going on that I found on the front face of her. And we're going to have to find our halfway points, or we're going to quarter this in, right? So I'm going to find my halfway. Then you're going to X those two halves, find those lines, and now you have your 4 quarters. So from here, what I like to do is add a center line. This is something that just helps me when I reference back to my original image. As you can see, I kind of threw in a very light gray center line on there. And it just helps me keep everything about where they should be. Alright, so I'm going to start with the head. Now this is where things get tricky, guys, because this is something that might seem a little odd to you. You're going to be drawing a very big head in comparison to that whole body. I mean, look at my head shape right now, and just know that the bottom of this rectangle has to be my toes. That proportion is way out the window from what I showed you guys in the beginning, but it's not wrong. It's because the proportions are skewed, right? So you can see here, I'm throwing in lines. I'm being very sketchy. I don't want to commit to anything just yet. A lot of this needs to be preliminary lines, figuring it out, testing the waters. I'm just like checking my reference back and forth here to make sure I got things correct, because things are just going to seem very oddly placed. So drawing in an indication of my feet here, I see that I barely see any of her legs, and it's because her arms are coming in front of her and she's kind of like holding her finger. So she's covering the majority of her leg. That's how dramatic of an angle this is. Just her arm being in front covers her upper leg pretty much all the way to her knee of space. So just going to kind of figure out a little more detail in here. You always want to think which way you're looking, so that's going to let you know which way your cylinders are of the 3D shapes that you're kind of blocking in. And then from here, it's just kind of trusting that the process was correct. So I know that I said I wasn't going to go into detail with this, I was just going to try to keep it simple, but looking at that original sketch drawing, I kind of saw that if this was something that you've never seen for the first time, you might think that's a little funky, and you're like, I don't see that happening. So I wanted to show you what happens when you do trust the process. You do follow that initial sketch that you made, and you do kind of lay in some detail over it, that you do end up getting a picture that looks very similar to the angle that you're trying to imitate here. So I just wanted to throw in some quick detail. I sped this up as much as I can realistically, so I'm not expecting anyone to draw this, but if you guys want, please pause the video and try it out. This has a lot of clothing, figure drawing going on in it, which that's another video all in itself. Heck, that's probably a whole series in itself. But if you guys like to give this a try, please give it a go. So again, just focusing on a little bit of that detail and showing how that initial sketch, even though it looked kind of funny, it looked kind of funky, how it does lead to something that looks pretty accurate. You know, it can be hard to look at this pose when you're drawing it and not think you're drawing a bobblehead, and that was something that was definitely hard to look past. But if you do trust the process and you kind of check your reference, check your drawing, see where you're at, you can get a pretty decent drawing out of this. Alright, so now that we finished our picture of looking up to down, let's check out this picture from a worm's eye view. So, similar concept, different angle. Don't let it confuse you. We still have the same properties going on. We just need to realize where our vanishing point is, right? So, it's pretty telling in this picture because we have a pretty extreme angle. We're really under this guy. And you can see that the vanishing point is probably somewhere up here because we're definitely looking at angles of something like that. So if we use this vanishing point up here to find this picture, it's just a randomly thrown in there vanishing point where I'm assuming the point is. I'm basing this off of nothing. But you guys can also just draw in your square in there. But what I'm going to do is bring it down to here, bring it down to here, and we're going to get the front of our box something like this, right? So we do want to remember too is if we know there's a vanishing point up here, there's got to be one over here and somewhere over here, right? Because we're seeing a couple different planes of this guy. But the reason I mention that is because we want to remember that the lines that are coming from here are at least somewhere in the distance, way off of our page for sure. They're going to be coming through and through and eventually meeting somewhere, right? It's not necessarily going to fall like that, but we do want to just remember that the lines that are coming down from here are eventually going to meet with the lines that are coming down from below, which are still following downwards, but they're going to be following a little less of a dramatic angle down. So now with that being said, I'm going to put a line across the top of his head right there, where I can kind of imagine that line going through. And this is just kind of honestly feeling it out. How do you feel the perspective is? I can also use the line right here on his chest to kind of gauge if that's correct or not. And then from his feet, I'm going to remember that these lines are also going this way. Just want to make sure that if they were to continue, yeah, they would eventually meet up at some point. Alright, so we have the rectangle around our guy here, and so what we're going to do is the same thing that we did with the girl previous to this. We're going to find our halfway point and see if it lines up about where we need it to. Alright, so I'm going to draw my X from corner to corner there, and then we're going to draw our halfway line through. As you guys can see, that this halfway line through is not falling on the waist. Remember, I was telling you guys that it's not going to always line up. But we do want to also remember that we're looking at this guy in a bit of a 3D angle, so that I know that this line would be somewhere going around back of him like this, and that it is going to eventually line up with that halfway point. So always remember, we're thinking about this in 3D forms, right? Alright, so now if I come in and divide this guy up again, so we can see that we have some landmarks, and they're not landing exactly where our human body tells us, right? So the halfway point, it tells us that it's somewhere at the waist, but we do know that if we were to find the backside of this guy, that the cube would be going somewhere down like this, and we would eventually line up with that waist about halfway in that cube. So similar, we have some of the same things here, where we can see that this is lining up with the shoulder here at a certain point, and we can see over here that if we were to come down with the same idea, that we're lining up eventually with that knee line. As you can see, I went in here and drew the cube as if it was going back into space, right? So I wanted to draw in the 3D figures, so I drew the green as a dark green so you guys can kind of tell the difference. And we can see that if we look at this as a cube, our points of proportions come back, right? We kind of see that it's meeting up with the shoulder. We see that it's meeting up a little bit with the waist and stuff like this. You guys don't have to go this far. You can stick with just that front facing 4-quartered rectangle if you guys like, and then you just use that as your reference. So once you break down your reference like I just did, now we're going to give it a try and draw it over here as if we're just using the guides as guides. Alright, so similar to the first one, we are doing our base drawing. We're looking at the 3D shape that we created on the left, and we're trying to imitate it on our own paper, right? What I do want to say here is don't worry about being so strict about it. As long as you get the general shape, you're going to get the general drawing, and it should be okay. As you can see, I'm just being very sketchy with it too, so I want you guys to take that same approach if you're going to try drawing this. Don't be so tight about it. Just let yourself try. This is one of those things where you have to just try it and really let yourself fail before you get good at it. And I know some people really can't handle that word, but sometimes you just have to do it in order to learn. So what I'm doing is I'm breaking down my drawing. I'm looking at the guidelines that I created on my cheat sheet, and I'm just crossing over. So like the line I'm at right now, that is my bottom of my fourth. So I was just checking, where does that line up? It lines up with his left hand. And then if I go to the other corner, I can see that it also lines up with his right hand, right behind his right thigh. I can see that I see a really great cylinder shape for the shorts, because we're essentially looking right under this dude, right? So we're looking right up, so we're seeing really right into his shorts. So thinking of those as circle shapes at first. Obviously fabric flows in different shapes in a perfect circle, but you just kind of want to block in the basic shapes. I'm always thinking about my cylinders, so cylinders in this shape, or in this view I should say, are going up. They're kind of creating hill shapes, versus if you guys go back to the first one where I did the looking down at that girl, the cylinders were going into U shapes. Alright, so I'm just kind of giving myself some guidelines to think about where the legs are going to fall through, right? And what really helped me was to be able to jump from different spots. And again, I'm using the idea that I can cross-reference with my picture over here and where that line lines up. So the bottom line cuts right underneath the big toe. So that's what helped me to go ahead and just draw it in here without having any leg or anything to attach it to. Realistically, if we're just thinking about this as in terms of focal points and stuff like that, the foot is essentially the head of this picture, right? It's the first thing we're reading. It's right in front of us. So you kind of wanted to think about that. And there's just some great curves in the leg too that I was able to notice. So I call this method connecting the dots. I'm sure there's probably a more technical term for this, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating 2 points. I have the shorts and I have the foot now. And so now I just had to connect everything in between there, which allowed me to be a little more loose and a little more accurate. I didn't have to worry so much about drawing each line. How long does the thigh go? Where do I start the calf? When do I do this? I was able to just kind of let myself find these points naturally. So here we got the right leg, or from our viewpoint, it's on his left side, but his right leg, right? So drawing that in, we know that it's directly next to the other foot, but definitely some space in between there as well. And again, I'm just trying to line it up with my guidelines, and took that off so I can see that big toe. And just because I have a knowledge of what this would look like, I want to draw that in there. And there you go, so we can polish this up a little bit. One thing I did find interesting, if you guys look at the top left of him, his shoulder goes in, and then his arm goes behind his body, and then his hand pops out right from behind his leg. So you're actually missing quite a lot of arm. And that's something that you get all the time with these interesting angles. Okay, so no more going over that guide on the person. Let's just get straight into drawing this. You guys see me draw that enough, and I'm sure you're over it. So we're tackling another top-down view here. I really like this guy's stance, his wide open legs, the cigarette. It's so old school. It's just a really classic kind of Frank Sinatra-ish kind of look. So again, same thing, just throwing in my guides. So finding my halfway point, finding the halfway of those halfway points, copying the shape the best I can, and doing my best to find that center line. Again, just throw it in nice and rough, make it look somewhat identical. Doesn't have to be perfect. Alright, so I had a trouble starting with this one. I wanted to start with the head, but as you can see, looking at the center line, the head is off to the side a little bit, so we have kind of an interesting pose. So in order to get past this block of, I just couldn't get that head in, I decided to throw his shoulders in first. I really liked how his shoulders were interacting with that head shape. So I kind of drew in that big blocked kind of suit shape that you get, you know, with the nice big shoulder pads up there. And it helped me to kind of come in and start figuring things out. So once I knew where his shoulders were, I was able to figure out a bit of where his head was. And I know that the top of his head is part of the top of that cube. So I didn't draw the top of the cube in there, but for my sake of reference, I was able to just kind of figure that out and draw it outside the box, right? From here, I was trying to force myself to not get so stuck on details and draw in the figure as I saw it. Now, we're seeing more of the left side of this guy than we are the right side, which is why we have this kind of skew going on. I see much less of his right side versus his left side, which is something that you want to emphasize. So the left side of his shoulder, again, this is our right looking at him, but it's his left. should be longer in appearance, in visual appearance, than the left side. And this is something that's going to help you give that appearance of the stance that this guy's giving us, where we're looking to him a little off to the side. We're not looking at him straight on like the last couple that we might have seen. All right, so you can see here, I am just kind of drawing in the suit jacket, and for right now, his arm, I just thought of it as straight cylinder shapes. I just kind of drew in some cylinder little sketches or circles in there, and that's all I want to do. And I want to move on to his legs now, so I'm going to draw in his waist area, and I really like the shape that his legs are giving in this picture. It's just such a wide stance, and the way the fabric of suit falls on legs also, it's such an awesome thing to draw, in my opinion. I don't know if anyone else feels that way, or if you're sitting there saying you sound like a weirdo right now, but I really liked it. This curve shape that this leg was giving us, it just felt so like organic and had so much energy to it, even though it's just a stance, right? He's just standing still taking a picture, but this picture to me just had so much energy going on inside of it. All right, so drawing in shoes here to kind of ground our image. And then now we're going to go back in and add some detail. I couldn't resist adding some detail on this guy, guys. Again, every time I probably say it, let's keep it simple, I'm probably going to make it complicated, so you can just count on that for any future videos. But what I wanted to do was just kind of, there's such solid shapes in here, such nice tones, that I just kind of wanted to figure it out a little bit more. And as you can see, I'm just kind of using my lines that I've created, and I'm finding the information that they're telling me is there. I don't need to find every single detail, but I personally like to find fabric folds and stuff like that. We have the best artist trick in the book right here, where one of his hands are in his pocket. So that's classic. That is artist trick 101. How do we get away without drawing a hand? Throw it in the pocket. This guy knew. He knew we were going to be drawing him. He did give us something complicated to do with his other hand, though, so maybe we can't thank him too soon. Alright, again, this isn't something that you have to go in and do. If you guys have the shapes thrown in there and you're happy with that, go ahead and keep the shapes. But I did just kind of want to show you guys that you can take these simple shapes that we're creating, these rough sketches, and you can turn into more. Just sometimes it's a process, and you got to follow that process and believe in it, and you do get something really great out of it. Okay guys, last one for this video. So we have another upward angle pose, and this is such an awesome pose. This is what these angles are all about. This is that classic Batman standing on top of a rooftop pose. So if you guys have any interest in comic books or anything like that, I definitely recommend giving this pose a go, because you're going to be drawing stuff like this a lot. I don't think I've ever read a comic book series that didn't have at some point this kind of angle in it, right? So again, going in, throwing in my shapes, you guys know the deal. Find the quarters. From here, I'm going to find my center line, and again, this is what helps me kind of figure out where things go on which side, right? Alright, so on this one I was able to start with the head, so I did. And I'm just kind of checking, how far down that first line does my chin go? How much of my neck do I see? And then where does her chest cut in front? Her chest is cutting in front of a lot of her body. We don't see any of her shoulder, any of her clavicle, or her traps, or anything like that. We barely see her neck. And that's just the angle that we're getting, right? It's her body is overlapping parts of her other body. So that kind of helps us to throw some things in. Again, think of the round areas, the cylinder areas. What kind of lines are you giving yourself as indications here? Where does the clothes wrap around? Is a good way to say it. So again, you can see right there I did my little connect the dots points where I started down at the bottom, and I just kind of was able to let myself organically find where this leg connected. Alright, so she had some fun shapes in the jeans that I couldn't help but draw. and drawing in that nice big leg shape. So this could be really confusing if this is your first time drawing stuff like this. Drawing in the feet and seeing the underside of shoes, not actually something that you probably do all the time. So just give yourself a little bit of time to adjust to this. Just try it out. You know, try to think of in your head, like, how would you see it? Or how would someone see you if they were pointed a camera from underneath or from above you? What are things that are going to show up first in perspective? What are things that are going to show up last? Is your head going to be much bigger than your feet? Is your feet going to be way bigger than your head? All these things you kind of want to think of. Alright, as I place in some final details here, guys, I really hope this video was helpful. I know it's hard. I know it's a lot. I'm sorry I sped up the video footage too a lot. I was trying my best to keep this video as short as I could. I even had another image that I ended up not even doing when I was making this video because I just had a feeling that this was going to end up being too long. So I tried to keep this as short as I could, but also keeping the footage slow enough that you guys could draw along, or at least if you guys need to, just feel free to pause it and come back to this video. Again, I hope this was helpful. If you guys have any more questions about this, please let me know, because I know this is something that can definitely be gone over multiple times, and you guys can send me different angles too. If I didn't cover an angle that maybe you've had trouble drawing in the past, please send that to me, comment it to me, let me know. And I will try to create that video in the future. This is going to be the last of my perspective videos because I can't think of any other perspective topics to talk about anymore. From here, maybe we'll go into something like clothes or more illustration techniques other than perspective. If you guys have any suggestions for videos like that or series that you would like to see that isn't animal life drawing that I already have going on, please let me know. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I can't wait to see the drawings that you got from this video series. And as always, have a great day.